I want to have the endless charge and motivation for the whole day. I want to be focused when I want, happy. Forget about anxiety and stress. It's difficult for me to get out of bed. Moreover, I can't start doing what I really want. How can I fix it quickly and easily?
This is the fundamental problem. The richest countries in the world are the countries that have the most anxiety, depression, and physical pain. The more we have a good life, like having a beer or playing a video game or eating a piece of chocolate, it depends who you are, we are suffering as a result of all of this access to these feel-good things. We are hardwired to approach pleasure and avoid pain, and that's really at the heart of our dopamine reward system. Dopamine is not just about the reward, it's also about the wanting and the motivation that really is at the heart of this motivational cycle. And this is by many different measures, many different survey measures, many different types of studies. But here's really the key. Your solution to this modern problem, and it's a modern problem that we all have, I think one of the most important findings in neuroscience in the last 100 years is that pleasure and pain are co-located, by which I mean that the same parts of the brain that process pleasure also process pain, and they work like opposite sides of the balance. So when we do something that's pleasurable or reinforcing or rewarding, that balance tips to the side of pleasure. When we experience something painful, like cutting our finger, it tips to the side of pain. But one of the overarching rules governing this balance is that it wants to remain level. It doesn't want to be tipped for very long, either to pleasure or pain. Reward itself, whatever it is, might be rewarding the first time around, but then over time, the way that we're wired will make it less reinforcing, less rewarding. So then we need a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more. So ultimately, the reward itself is not the thing to seek because it's the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. It's ever elusive. We are hardwired to approach pleasure and avoid pain, and that's really at the heart of our dopamine reward system. Now, in my clinical experience, in my practice, because I have patients who come in seeking help for anxiety, depression, insomnia, and the first thing that I will typically do is to have them cut out their feel-good drugs and behaviors, at least for long enough for essentially dopamine fasting, right? Whatever your source of dopamine is, to cut it out for long enough. And it's relative dopamine, so it's whether our dopamine is above or below tonic baseline. From an evolutionary perspective, the just so story that we can tell ourselves is that the reason that Mother Nature made a reward pathway that doesn't just give us the reward, but also makes us pay for it afterwards by going into this dopamine deficit state, is because that's the ideal biological system to drive us to continue to seek to never be contented with what we have. And the brain will work very hard to restore a level balance, or what neuroscientists call homeostasis. And that any deviation from neutrality is actually a form of stress. In fact, biologists define stress as a deviation in either direction. And that's really the key. The problem with modern life, and one of the main problems with modern life, is that we have too many pleasurable substances and behaviors, and that is actually stressing us out. It's literally stress. So when we do something that's obviously pleasurable, like, having a beer or playing a video game or eating a piece of chocolate, it depends who you are because people are different. But in general, those things are pleasurable to many people. What we do is we get a little tilt to the pleasure side, and we get the release of dopamine in our brain's reward pathway, which is this evolutionarily, phylogenetically conserved, very, very old part of the brain that's been unchanged in our brains for just millennia and is also identical in other species, all the way down to the lizard, which is why it's sometimes called the lizard brain. Our evolution meant that we've piled a whole bunch of other layers on top, but that part is exactly the same as it's always been. And it's the part that gets us, again, to approach pleasure and avoid pain. But here's really the key. The way that the brain restores a level balance or homeostasis after this deviation to the pleasure side is to not just bring it level again, but tilt it an equal and opposite amount to the side of pain. And that's called the opponent process reaction. And I sort of think of that as these little gremlins that represent neuroadaptation, hopping on the pain side of the balance, but they like it on the balance, so they stay on until it's tipped an equal and opposite amount. That's that moment of wanting just one more video game, another beer, another piece of chocolate. Now, if we wait a little bit because it's a powerful physiologic drive to reach for more. If we wait, the gremlins hop off, that feeling passes, and homeostasis is restored. And over time, what that means is that we're bombarding our dopamine reward pathway with way more dopamine than our primitive brains can handle. And the result is that we end up with enough gremlins on the pain side of the balance to fill this whole room. And they are now camped out there. And that's called allostasis. So we've gone from homeostasis to allostasis. Now, allostasis is where our body has to accommodate and work very, very hard to try to restore homeostasis. And if it's unable to do that using the normal mechanisms, it essentially changes our set point. So now we've got those gremlins camped out there. They're not leaving. Even when we wait a while, they're camped out there.
It's actually easier to tip it to
That's
the side
right.
of pain.
It's easier to tip it to the side of pain, and it's really, really hard now to experience pleasure. This is the fundamental problem. If you look at rates of depression and anxiety all over the world today, they are going up. And this is by many different measures, many different survey measures, many different types of studies. So clearly we have something very strange going on here. And I do think that the pleasure-pain balance explains that. Because our primitive brains were not wired for an easy, hyper-convenient world, we are suffering as a result of all of this access to these feel-good things.